So the faithful remnant who've made it through to the end. And thanks very much to Dan and for all the panellists for that very enlightening and informative panel there. What I want to do is just to offer a few reflections on the conference, and then we'll come on to a few more nitty-gritty things and a few thanks as well after that. But before I do, I'd like to invite Bishop Graham Kings up to read out a message of support that we've had during the course of the conference. So if you'd like to come forward, Bishop Graham.
I've got to find it first.
I've got it here if you want.
Oh, no, I got it here. Yeah.
There we are.
I ended up being the bencher for Rowan Williams, this was mentioned earlier on. So Peter Fan said we were at a conference together, and Rowan was very sorry that he couldn't come and suggested I came. So I gave greetings to Rowan in an email, and he sent this back. Dear Graham, many thanks for the greetings. I am so sorry that I can't be there. The combination of an important subject, a location which has very happy associations for me, and the company of people for whom I have such affection and esteem, very nearly prompted me to tear up my diary for these few days. But realism, alas, prevailed. Blessings and best wishes to all, as ever, Rowan. So that's for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Graham, and thank you, Bishop Rowan. So just a few reflections on the conference from my own point of view. And before I do that, I'm not going to ask anybody else up, but I just want to embarrass the man sitting on my left, because he'll go on and invite and thank all sorts of people who've helped and made it possible, but it would never have happened had it not been for Gerard. It's not finished yet, because no doubt there'll still be a party. Gerard has the greatest stamina of any person I've ever met in my life. You can get by on 2 hours sleep and still be there at Mass looking fresh-faced in the morning. Just as well they don't do fasting Masses anymore, but anyway. Now, over the last few days, which actually seemed like about 3 weeks since I gave my lecture on Thursday, I've certainly learnt a great deal about Vatican II, especially since my own expertise rests really in another century and in another church. So it's been a wonderful education, and I expect particularly to learn about the impact of Vatican II on interfaith relations. And it's been particularly moving, really, to hear from a great many people who have a deep experience of working in that post-conciliar church, of trying to enact the kind of things that were laid down in the Vatican Council and to put those things into practice, sometimes against the odds. And Cardinal Casper yesterday was a particularly inspirational speech that he gave in the cathedral. A man of deep humility, but a man who still has a vision for the future. And I guess that gives us a great sense of hope, the kind of Franciscan rays of hope that the peonies might blossom. I'm sure that's a great mixture of metaphors, but things are changing around us, and we've experienced some of that. A completely different mood. Some of us here were in Assisi, 3 years ago now. A very different mood for the future, a great sense that things are changing, and things are changing very rapidly. But I think probably one of the more important things that I've learnt over the last few days is the opportunity really to think about the imperatives that all of us face for the future. All of us who are interested in ecumenism, all of us who are interested really in the future of the proclamation of the gospel. Just how things have changed from only 50 years ago. 50 years ago, I was a little boy. Things were extremely different then. being open to the world, which has been one of the main themes of this conference, means something completely and utterly different from what it was like at the end of the council. The world has changed beyond recognition. Just an example from my own church, the Church of England. When I was born in 1960, about 55% of English children were baptised into the Church of England. Last year, it was less than 12%. That's an extraordinary change in only 50 years. Ecumenism is no longer a luxury. Ecumenism is now a missionary imperative, at least in Western Europe. But that's an imperative that has to deal with the modern world, not as we'd like it to be, but the modern world as it really is. In Europe and in North America, perhaps a little slowly, things have changed beyond recognition. Just to take one example, most of you will have heard that the people of Ireland voted overwhelmingly in favour on Friday of same-sex marriage, something that would have been completely unthinkable only 20 years ago. What do we do in response to that kind of dramatic change in the mores, the social mores of society, even traditional societies like Ireland? The Archbishop of Dublin, the Catholic Archbishop of Dublin, Dermot Martin, said that the Reformation was an affirmation of the views of young people. Young people think very differently from old people. He said, "I appreciate how gay and lesbian men and women feel on this day, that they feel this is something that is enriching the way they live. I think it is a social revolution." A social revolution. What does the church do in response? Well, what he said is that the church has a huge task in front of it. I really think the church needs to do a reality check. A reality check. And that's a reality check of a reality that's created and redeemed by God. But what does reality look like in 2015, and how different that is from 1965? Just a reflection on my own from this morning's Mass. I'm not sure that changing liturgical language is really at the vanguard of where we need to be. But anyway, we used to all share the same responses. We don't any longer. That's an ecumenism that nobody, or a sort of failure of ecumenism that not many people noticed. Anyway, there are other realities as well which have become apparent over the course of the conference. One thing that I think we're beginning to realise, and it's difficult to do so in an environment like this, the West is no longer triumphant in Christianity. And that's something that I think all of us have begun to sense. Other voices need to be heard. Other parts of the world need to be heard far more loudly than perhaps they've been over the last few days. How do we get to hear those voices? It was important to have Cardinal Tagle here reminding us that Christianity is a global phenomenon, and the strength, the growth of the church is not in this part of the world. It's not where I come from either. Things have changed. The centre of Christianity is no longer Europe, no longer Rome, no longer Canterbury, somewhere completely different. And I think that global dimension is being painfully played out in all sorts of places, not least in my own Anglican communion. But it's becoming obvious in the world's most dominant, the world's biggest church as well. The global dimension is something that's becoming increasingly apparent. So dialogue, the kind of dialogue that's initiated in the Second Vatican Council, is something that is as much internal between Christians, within the churches, within each individual church and between the churches, as well as something that's external as well, something that needs to be open to the world, needs to embrace the world, but it also needs to try and understand what the churches are really like in the face of the reality that all of us face. So in some senses, all ecumenists have to be kind of Janus-like, looking inside the churches and outside the churches at the same time, open to the world, but also open to ourselves and how we look to the world. That's what a reality check really means. How do we look to those outside? What are those people in the churches really like? How do they express what Cardinal Kasper called the ecumenism of love? How do we express love? How do we find that kind of mercy that comes with judgment? So we're open to the world, open to ourselves, and how we look to the world. That's central for what we're doing. And that is obviously a truly global task. And that leads me to start thinking about where to go from here, and where Gerard will say a little bit about that in a moment. But we want to try and host a conference outside of the North American, European world to be able to reflect on how those things look from another part, another perspective. So what I've learnt over the last few days is something about the nature of dialogue, the complexity, the painful process of dialogue, of getting to understand those who are different, both within and outside. We've initiated the process, but it's only just beginning, the beginning of the beginning, as Cardinal Casper said yesterday, the beginning of the beginning. But those blossoms are there, to use that metaphor once again, waiting to burst forth. And all of us who are interested in ecumenism, ultimately interested in the mission of God to his world, all of us need to ensure that those blossoms come to life and shine amidst the darkness all around us. So that's where I'll finish, on that note which sets the agenda for the future. And now we can move in some quite more practical ways. So Gerard.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks to all of you. Apologies to our speakers. I didn't realise until I got up here how blinding these headlamps are. So sorry for that. I could see some people struggling with them earlier. So we started off saying, Vatican II, did anything happen? What's still happening? What needs to happen into the future? I have a confession to make in trying to draw these thoughts together. I had something of a misspent youth in many ways, like many academics. That doesn't mean I spend a lot of time in pubs and bars. For any Irishman, that would never be time misspent. But I spend an awful lot of time in second-hand or used bookstores. Of course, they're dying out now, thanks to the internet in so many places. But a long time ago, I can't remember exactly when, it was probably when I was an undergraduate in Cambridge, I picked up for 30 pence, so it was a bargain, because I've used it often since, one of the best books on the Second Vatican Council, I think, was ever written. And it's called Road to Renewal, which was written not long after the Council by Bernard Haring, the Redemptorist moral theologian. And I want to share some of that book with you. I can recommend it for people who know all about the Council and for people who know very little about the Council. It's one of the best overviews and brief interpretations of what the significance of the Council was. At the beginning of that book, Haring himself addresses some of the questions that we've been addressing in the last few days. And I quote, page 9 to 10 for those of you who want to check it. Up to the convocation of the third session of the Council, wags were heard to comment that the mountains had laboured mightily and brought forth only a tiny mouse, and that the only concrete result of the Council's deliberations had been the inclusion of St. Joseph in the canon. The well-known Protestant theologian Karl Barth replied to this laboured witticism with the declaration that it was no small achievement on the part of the Council and of Pope John to bring humble St. Joseph into the canon of the Mass, and thereby into the whole life of the Church. Meanwhile, however, those who had been hoping that all would remain as before, save for the inclusion of St. Joseph in the Mass, began to feel less comfortable. They were aware now of the fact that everything had been set in motion and were beginning to fear that in the end this movement would also force them to change. What happened? What is still happening? What needs to happen? We've had so many rich and wonderful contributions on the Council, and past, present, future in the past few days. It's been a real embarrassment of riches, a treasure trove of so many rich perspectives. The Council fathers themselves and all who took part in the Council and people around the world also knew that the end of the Council was simply the end of the beginning. The preface of Haring's book contains words from the closing speech of Pope Paul VI at the close of the council itself. And Haring gives this the title, "Now the Council Must Begin." So just a quote from Pope Paul's final address to the council, pages 7 to 8 in Haring's book. "The hour for departure and separation has sounded. In a few moments you are about to leave the council assembly, to go out to meet mankind and to bring the good news of the gospel of Christ and of the renovation of his church at which we have been working together for 4 years. This is a unique moment, a moment of incomparable significance and riches. In this universal assembly, in this privileged point of time and space, there converge together the past, the present, and the future. The past, for here, gathered in this spot, we have the Church of Christ with her tradition, her history, her councils, her doctors, her saints. The present, for here we are taking leave of one another to go out toward the world of today with its miseries, its sufferings, its sins, but also with its prodigious accomplishments, its values, its virtues. And lastly, the future is here in the urgent appeal of the peoples of the world for more justice, in their will for peace, in their conscious or unconscious thirst for a higher life. We will want to gather together the rich voices we've heard in recent days, and to continue the conversation. We, in the Ecclesiological Investigations Network, we never want the departures of tired and weary, hopefully well-fed souls to be the final word. So you will be receiving a few emails in the coming days and weeks. First of all, to ask you to send your photos to a shared Dropbox by which we can share the snaps that various people have been taking. Second, which is enormously important, we want to hear your opinion and experiences of the past few days. So there will be a survey. The survey is actually already on our website, which is dc2015.ei-research/survey. So the conference webpage /survey. You will get a link in an email to this. It's very important for us because we want to hear what you found valuable, what suggestions you may have for the future, and this will also help us to, when we plan future events and reach out to foundations, also what this type of engagement, what things like the EI network can do for your context, your region, your locality. So we want to hear your ideas, and maybe you will have suggestions for themes. Maybe you have an institution that would think of hosting something in the future. Second, we'll be asking everyone who submitted a paper to consider writing up an expanded version for that paper to be considered for some volumes which we hope to produce to come out of it. The papers were so rich and informative, it would be a great shame that only the people who could make it here would be able to benefit from them. And collectively, they come together as such a rich resource for future dialogue on so many different fronts. So we started off by saying we have friends, old and new, gathered. I hope some of those who are new will become friends old at future events. You've been engaged. There were lots of debates about ecumenical interfaith dialogue methods and critique and so on and so forth. You've been engaged in what is an ongoing experiment in trying to develop not a completely new or innovative method, but to a certain extent, in many ways, with new and original features, which we began even before Assisi, but very much consciously in Assisi. And we adopted there the language of the tracks of diplomacy dialogue. At the political and conflict resolution, they speak of track 1 dialogue, which would be the official representatives of governments or official bodies. Track 2 dialogue would be the more grassroots and localized level. And in recent years in the international peace building and conflict resolution literature, there's been talk about trying to build a track 1.5, which bridges those dialogues. Many of you here have vast experience of being involved at official level dialogue on multiple fronts. Many of you have vast experience of being involved in grassroots and local, regional, contextual dialogues. We heard about some of these from our wonderful speakers in the panel this afternoon. With Assisi, we began to think, well, how do you bridge those two in the ecumenical and interfaith method? And you can achieve an awful lot when you have the freedom from not having to trot out official lines and stick to official policies, but also that you bring together people from localities and different contexts so that they can interact. And one of the key methods, of course, the papers are vital in the focus. But you may have noticed there are certain social moments of our programme, and those who've been to other EI events in the past will notice that as a distinctive feature. The coffee breaks, the meals, coffee breaks as at Vatican II, bar none, bar Jonah, the evening meals, the dinners, the late night wisdom hunting over collective glasses and beverages, these are as important as the papers, sometimes for many more important, because it's the interaction and the engagement that drives the dialogue. Professor Heschel this morning in her wonderful address spoke about the many rich personal encounters that her father, Rabbi Abraham Heschel, had with so many different Christians from around the world, and particularly people who were key in Vatican II and key in the church since. The Vatican II observers from other churches also spoke about their personal interactions, and many of the key theological advisors at the Council and many of the key Council Fathers themselves spoke about their personal interaction with those observers from beyond the Roman Catholic Church. That interaction is vital. The late, great Margaret O'Gara, a wonderful pioneer and veteran herself of many ecumenical initiatives, a book has just been published, edited by her husband, which is a wonderful collection of many of her final essays. And one of those talks about the personal encounters she has enjoyed over her long career in the ecumenical movement. And she points towards the significance of that this is what makes the progress. Yes, the study, the paper, the interaction, the revisions, the debate, the robust disagreements at times, this is important. But the personal engagement really drives ecumenical and interfaith dialogue. This is what counts. Frank, in his wonderful paper just now, spoke about the Mary untying the knots and the Hindu symbols coming together. This is an encounter. These are the things that drive the dialogue. Cardinal Casper spoke about yesterday in his wonderful paper that the constructive creative encounter between ethnic, social, cultural and religious groups, for this the word transversal has in the meantime come into common disciplinary use. What it signifies is not hierarchical thinking, but cross-thinking, which unites identity and plurality creatively. That could be a good definition of a track 1.5 method. Towards the end of his address yesterday, he spoke about ecumenism occurs not in standing still, but in moving on. Only water that flows remains fresh, while standing water turns bad and becomes stagnant. And when you gave him that very much deserved standing ovation, he turned to me and he said, well, he said, there's no real method there, you know. And I said, but there is a method. It's a method of moving forward and keep moving forward with hope and with energy. Next year, as Mark said, we want to take the conversation outside of the Euro-North American world, not for the first time. Our very second conference was actually in India, in Kottayam, and we want to go to China. And as a uniting theme, which will bring together secular, religious, and what many other disciplines, will be faith in China. And it will probably be less internationally diverse than this gathering, because there's only a year to plan it now, and not enough hours in the day to plan it on quite the same grand scale. But we know there will be a lot of Asian participation, and we hope many of you can be part of that, and some details will go out fairly soon. It's going to be around the third week of July, which is hot and humid in Hong Kong, but we're dependent upon our hosts for that. The following year, we'll be coming back to Europe, because it's the quincentenary of the Reformation from the Lutheran starting point. And we want to do something different, just as with Vatican II, we want to do something different because everyone will be commemorating the beginning of the Reformation with Martin Luther. We're going to look at the Reformation as a global event and try to bring voices from around the world to say what impact, much like with Vatican II, what impact did the Reformation make in their context? What impact does it continue to make? What impact can it may it make into the future. I want to just single out a few people for thanks. There are hundreds of people to thank, not least of all of you, our wonderful speakers, our dignitaries from other faith communities and other churches as well. But I think the people who really worked the hardest and put in the most obviously were the organising committee, and they all bear the scars of pretty much the last 18 months. Many of them also bear the scars of having had no sleep, not just this week, but way back. And just to single them out, just so we can recognise them, so I'll list them together, and then we can show them a round of applause. So John Borelli, who many of you have met. Mark, to my left, who has been a long-time collaborator throughout the whole history of ecclesiological investigations. Drew Christensen, from the Jesuit community here and a professor here at Georgetown University. Miriam Haar, from Trinity College Dublin and the Evangelische Landeskirche in Wittenberg, Germany. Peter Herman, a doctoral student here at Georgetown. Leo Lefebvre, our colleague here at Georgetown as well. Peter de May from KU Leuven back in Belgium. Peter Fan, of course, who needs no introduction. As to paraphrase Peter Fan, if you don't know who Peter Fan is, that's your problem. Sam Wagner, who was tremendous behind the scenes with the President's office. And I hope I'm not going to leave anybody out. I'm holding two in reserve, as you know. Tanara Wilkinson, one of our doctoral students who worked very hard with us as well. Mike Friedman, another great doctoral student here. It's hard to try and single out any of this band of heroes, but there are some who slept less, just a little maybe, than some of the others, and who really deserve a special mention as well. And those are Father Jason Welly, Vladimir Latinovich, and Brian Flanagan from Marymount University. I want to thank all of the committee, but those three, if you like, deserve a little extra whiskey tonight, because they are going to sleep the sleep of the just this evening, should they get any sleep. So please join me in showing all of these a great round of applause. We could actually spend another panel going through the things that all of those people did, from John ferrying cardinals around to Drew finding bedrooms in places we didn't even know there were rooms for various religions from around the world, and Leo reaching out to so many people across far and wide. We could go on and on and on, but unfortunately we have to come to a close. A couple of practical matters. Those of you staying on campus, there is breakfast in the Healy Family Student Centre tomorrow. Maybe some of you will still be there from this evening. Paul Lakeland would be very glad if you were. This evening there will be pre-dinner aperitivos. They just have to be moved from my office down to the Healy Family Student Centre. So take a seat when you get down there, and look forward to the rewards for your exploits over the past few days. We writed you about the Dropbox. I think, is there any more practicals towards the end? I think that's probably it, except for just one more thing from Bernard Herring. So he's talking about Nostra Aetate, but he's really summing up the significance of the council, and I think this sums up the significance of our 4 days together as well. And so the last people I want to thank are all of you. And I've managed to interact with many of you, and some of you more than others. I hope tonight I can interact with many more. I know some of you will be travelling, but we'd love to see you again at our events. So this is from 101 and 102 of Herring. Dialogue before all else signifies that we take others seriously. The art of knowing how to listen is indispensable if one wants to be taken seriously. The others really have something to say to us, even if it merely be the reason why they do not understand or do not find the message of salvation as we interpret it acceptable. The Pastoral Constitution on a Church in the Modern World is not afraid to say that the serious study of modern atheism may impel Christians to feel the need to examine their consciences and ask themselves, by our theological language and by our way of life, have we always and everywhere proposed to modern man the true image of the living God and Father of all men in a convincing manner? Is not the protest of some atheists less a denial of the Most High than it is an accusation against a trivialization or a profanation of the real meaning of God? A respectful attitude to the true values which are found in the religiosity and the traditions of non-Christian religions is above all else a precept of the virtue of religion. We must praise God for all the good that God has wrought, maintained, or renewed among those from other faiths. What the Council has done to establish an honest dialogue is an expression of the universal love which Christ proclaimed as his commandment. Only if one sows love in a language comprehensible to others can one hope that they will feel impelled to seek the hidden source of this love. The assertion of religious freedom and the search for dialogue and cooperation with other faiths has nothing to do with indifferentism or syncretism. On the contrary, such an attitude springs from firmness and joy in our faith. Truth lived and proclaimed in love is stronger than all the powers of this world. It attracts all people of goodwill and effects a true clarification of ideas. Thank you.